Hello, everybody. So this is actually not about documentation. I'm sorry. It's about education. And I'm going to talk about my trip, my voyage from being a technical writer on the documentation team to a technical writer on the education team. And I'm going to talk about, like I say, a personal journey. So how I reflected on what I need to maybe change about what I do in order to get to become a good education writer. And so I'll just focus in on three areas that I think are really important: is writing, content, and audience. So I just wanted to introduce the new team I'm on. So this is the education team. There's 5 of us. And what we do is a lot of things on the education team. We actually cover, this is not what we do, this is how we do it. These are all the possible ways to teach people. And when I was on documentation, it was much different. It was much simpler for a number of reasons that I'll talk about. And my focus on both the documentation team and on education was text. But in my current role, I also am working on providing content for videos and also doing live trainings. So the logical first place for me to reflect on the change would be to ask myself, will my writing have to change? Will I have to do anything different as a writer? And so the first thing I do is I think about language, and I ask the typical question, what do I need to do? As a technical writer, I always need to be clear, but 2 other words thought about: impact and empathy. So the first kind of motto of a writer is to show, don't tell. I don't know if anybody has heard that phrase, but it's typical what you learn about when you learn about writing. And what does that mean? So I have here a quote from Ernest Hemingway, who often is very clear and simple in his writing. This is an example where I think he goes much further, and this is an example of showing and not telling. So I'm going to read it as the best as I can. Slowly, I'll just read it, and then we can talk about it. So the trunks of the trees were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising and leaves falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterwards the road bare and white except for the leaves. So it's a hard sentence to read. It's a long sentence. And so why am I bringing this up? Because in terms of writing, what we're doing here is showing, and we're not telling anything. The only tell we have is that there are soldiers involved, but everything else is about dust and leaves and a road, and we don't even know where we are. We just know maybe war is involved because there are soldiers. And I highlight war, we saw soldiers, because the we saw tells me that this is the beginning of a novel, and it's telling me that the novel is going to be the point of view of somebody. And if I remember correctly, it's a child. And then there's this idea of dust rising and leaves falling, so I can imagine death in some way, or going to heaven, I don't know. And there's so much more you can do from this, and that's literature, right? And so what is technical writing? Technical writing would break down the text in this way and make it very clear what's going on. So you would basically say war has bombs and guns, and soldiers are everywhere, and some of them survive, some of them don't. Very clear, we have no problems, there's no ambiguity, there's nothing. And you would want to remove the last sentence because it's not really necessary. So that's technical writing. And I'm not saying it destroys literature, I'm just saying it's not literature. And here's another example of the same author who came up with a 6-word story: For sale, baby shoes never worn. Not at all tell. But if you go into a journalist writing, not a technical writing, you would find out that actually this was a reference to an actual tragedy of a baby who never made it. And so I know I'm talking about war and babies dying, so I'm going to switch to something a little bit more pleasant. Here I feel like this is totally show. I would want to dive into the chocolate, right? If you're into chocolate. If you're not, there's other kinds of candy and stuff you could do. And this is like a tell, which is all right, but it's boring. So this is like one of the things I had to think about, and I'll put this all together. Why is this not documentation? Why is this education? So, but the next thing would be, as a writer, I think about empathy, and literature comes to mind when I think of empathy. I could say that it provokes an understanding. It uses empathy, and it also creates uncertainty. Now, why would literature want to create uncertainty? Because there's just so many reasons for that. But it just makes me want to think about things, makes me want to resolve things. It makes me want to be uncomfortable, whatever. That's literature. Then you get into technical writing. So is technical writing about empathy and uncertainty? There's only one way I would resolve that, is I would just say technical writing removes uncertainty. And I think that's good technical writing. We don't want uncertainty. And empathy I put a little bit light, because I'm sure the only aspect of empathy is get it right. Because that's really caring, that you make what you say very clear. That's the only empathy I can come up with. Please feel free to disagree. So education also deals with these two ideas. I feel empathy comes back to the forefront, and I feel there is an aspect of uncertainty. It provokes understanding, but it also removes uncertainty. So education is interesting. It kind of works in both directions. And again, I will get to how I see that. But just to summarize, that both education and documentation require a technical writer. So I'm happy about that. And let me just define technical writing. Technical writing is the craft of transforming complex information into usable content. It's clear, unambiguous, concise, efficient, and to the point. That's technical writing. Education combines the power of literature with the precision of technical writing. This helped me a lot going into education. So if that helps anybody, I'm very happy. And I really think that's important, is that you need to engage people for education differently than you would need to engage in documentation. And that will be my next subject. So content. Content is important. So what am I doing in education? What am I doing in documentation? So let's oppose the two and see what we come up with. So what is documentation? It's providing answers as quickly as possible. This is what people need. Education spends more time on providing an understanding or a deeper understanding. That's how I oppose the two. So let's go back to show and tell. I feel that documentation is very much tell and then show. And education is very much show and tell. So let's talk about how documentation is tell. The first sentence is telling me what I need to do in the first step. It's telling me that I need to set up and configure an index with attributes and records. You don't need to understand this, but this is for anybody who works with computer science. I'm basically saying this is how you create a database or an index. If you don't get that, I can give you a little bit of a show and give you an example of what I'm saying. So this is pretty good documentation. Education is show, don't tell, and what do I mean by that? So this is just an extract of a tutorial I wrote recently. And so I'll just go to this part here. This is more of a tell slide. I would say that a developer would like to know what they're learning up front. So I'm going to teach them about relevance and ranking and searchable attributes and custom ranking. I think that's great, but if my reader is not technical, and this is going to be a theme, then this is not going to really work as a first slide. I think a first slide would be to really just talk about a book and talk about what do you need in order to understand what a book is. And then let's see what they call attributes. And again, I need to define what an attribute. I need to be conscious of my audience. And let's just define, and let's just talk about what a book includes, right? And then let's go a little bit further, and let's say what you need in order to define a book and what you don't need in order to define a book. And then let's put it into context and move towards these. And so this is an example, I feel, of very much show and then eventually getting to a tell. It's a process of getting to a more complicated subject for people. A developer would not necessarily need this approach in this particular subject because it's data, and that's pretty common for a developer. But maybe there are other subjects where, and education has both audiences, developers and non-developers, and there are times when a developer needs more explanation. So just to summarize, documentation assumes the reader already understands the subject. They just need a little help. And education is more about if that user does not have that basic understanding, you need to start educating them. This is kind of a basic thing. So it's really not an opposition. It's really, they work together. They have their own area of concern, and they also have an area where there's a lot of overlap. So you'll see some education in documentation and vice versa. But for me, it's this direction where you go, you teach, and then you document, and you help people answer questions. And you could also see that in documentation. If you don't really get what's being said, then maybe the documentation itself or the education team will go a little bit step further and give context. And so developer experience is on the documentation side. Great developer experience is great documentation. And then you have the business user experience, the non-technical user. They will get a lot from the education approach. So again, just to repeat that slide, we have lots of ways to teach people in the education team. And so my last point is about the audience. And I think I've been talking a little bit about the audience, about business users and developers. So let's get more precise about that. And just the keyword product. In Algolia, we really think of documentation as a product, and we think of education as a product. So that was this slide, is that you have a product that you document, and you have a product that you teach using. All right, so is Algolia's product an API? Any company can ask themselves, is my product something very technical? What we've discovered in Algolia is that yes, maybe 5 years ago it was, but now we've developed so many features on top of the technical API of search that we have analytics, we have personalization, we have ways to do search merchandising, promoting items. How do you control the search in a way that helps the business? And we've discovered that, like, this is probably wrong, but I'd say 50% now of our users are non-technical, and 50% are technical. And we are not reaching out to them in our documentation as much as we actually are, but it's because it's kind of framed within a technical look and feel. They're not even noticing that we've made great efforts to speak directly to them. So what we've discovered in Algolia by creating a task force is that developers are very happy, but the business users are relying entirely on human support. And this is time consuming for both, and it's frustrating for both sides of that equation. And so, like I say, we created a task force. And the task force was a group of people from all different professions. And we asked ourselves how we can help non-technical people do technical things. And what we did is we reached out to everybody in the company who was non-technical. We reached out a little bit to the customers, but not so much. We're doing that now more and more. And what we discovered in terms of answering that question is we need to imagine, it's all about point of view and getting inside the shoes of somebody else. And that's about empathy. And we ask the question, who are you? What do you need? What is your goal? And where are your frustrations? And so when we ask that question to developers, we ask who you are, and we come up with some really cool ways to think about developers, front end, back end, experience. And we also, what are they trying to accomplish? Sometimes it's about implementation from the A to Z, tutorial-oriented kind of content, and then you get wild troubleshooting, very precise questions. And what do they all have in common is that they understand computer science notions. They know what a database is. They know what a method is. They know so many things. It makes documentation's life very easy. Our audience is kind of simple. They just need some answers. They really need straightforward answers. They need questions answered. And so the documentation has pretty cool ways of doing that. Code, reference material, short descriptive text examples. The less said, the better, and make it scannable. Make it easy to find information. And the question is bounce rate. What is the bounce rate for non-technical readers on our docs? How long are they actually using our docs is the idea of bounce rate, right? Are they going in and jumping right out? And apparently, yes. Our business users are jumping into our docs, and they're jumping right out, even though there is content for them. So what do we do about that? The same set of questions. We get into their shoes, we find out who they are and their pain points, and we start drawing a profile. It's much more complicated than basic computer science notions. It's really more complicated. So we need to really understand what they're trying to do. For example, we have merchandisers who are concerned about, with selling their products in the best way possible. There are people like product managers who are building products. There are tech leaders who are maybe not even technical, but they're leading a tech team. What are their frustrations? All these people, what are their learning needs? What are their preferences in learning? So what we did is this kind of classic in the industry is to create a profile and ask lots of questions. So I'll make it simple, just because there's so much you can find out about people. But let's just say she here, who's a support engineer, needs to know what her learning needs. She just doesn't understand the ecosystem. She doesn't understand what an API is. She doesn't understand what language, we support 11 programming languages. She doesn't understand that. She needs to know that. She also might be getting some frustration on not knowing who to contact when she has a problem on support. And she might have some learning preferences. She might like to do something to learn, whereas another person might like to read or watch a video. This is cool, and we have lots of these kind of profiles. Not a lot, but we have. It takes time, and we go right out to the customer community and ask these lots of questions. And what you discover is you actually have lots of profiles. And thanks to having lots of profiles, you have a more complex set of, you have a more complex job ahead of you to communicate. And so just to summarize some of the things that I keep in mind now when I write educational materials, I really focus in on point of view. I don't make assumptions about words or context. And so focusing on the gaps is really important. Don't waste anybody's time. If they know something, don't waste their time on it, because you want to put all your energy on teaching them something they don't know. And that's the challenge. And putting that together. And creating time and space is also very important. It's really about giving them a place they can go to and look for material. And if they like videos, like I say, or if they need more time, or if they need to do something. So you need to do that. This is just some of the guidelines that it develops over time. And so our friend becomes happy, right? That's the idea. So empathy is kind of an underlying term. And just to summarize the points I've made, language is really important for me in making my journey. Understanding the goal of both documentation and teaching, and knowing your audience. So I'm going to just finish off on a question. So I don't know. Is anybody who would find that literature is more fun to read than documentation or educational content? Okay, cool. What's more fun, documentation? Anybody? Okay, cool. Education? Any? Yeah. Got a few hands over there. That's cool. So it's kind of a trick question. Is that actually we don't read the docs, in my opinion. We use them, and we don't really read educational content. We learn from them. The point I'm making here is not to just make a silly trick question, annoying trick question, is to actually talk about, once again, remind people that documentation is a product, and educational content is a product, and we use products to achieve certain goals, and that's what they're all about. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Do we have questions for Peter? Anybody has a question for Peter? Don't be shy. All right. Turn it around.
Yes, it's working. So I have actually two questions. So the first one is, as a developer, and now when I Google something, I often go on, I reach to medium.com. So I would like to know what's your opinion on the articles which are written on Medium.
The articles on Medium?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. It's not great literature. I would have raised my hand on literature. So no, I think they're actually really amazing because there's so many good writers who are able to combine documentation and education, meaning that they're able to write an article where you feel like you're learning something and also getting answers immediately answered. But I mean, I'm picking the best, so I'm being optimistic, so maybe you have a different experience, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Well, my experience is that I I rather prefer Stack Overflow than Medium because I think that Medium is something like bad literature. And okay, and the second question I have is that as we said, or as Seneca said, in teaching we learn. I would like to know what's your biggest learn from this journey of yours.
That's a good question. I think it's not necessarily about learning. It's about having felt something very strongly for a long time and finding like a channel for that. So I always felt like I wanted to reach out to people who don't know something before they get the answer, look for the answers. So for me, it's that realization. It's like a place I belong, you know. And so then I talked about how I reflected on this, and I learned a lot, and I'm building on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have other questions for Peter? Yes, over there. Can you throw the catch box?
Whoa!
Can you not destroy the catch box?
This part's the important part.
Yeah. I was wondering how many formats you support for your educational content, and why those choices were made.
So let me see if I can get to it. The education team has been around for 5 years, I think, or 4 or 5 years. I just started about 4 months ago. And it started with videos. So the person who started the education team really wanted to, he was a solutions engineer, so he was a developer who felt like developers were not always understanding things. And he wanted to use the video format. And so when I talk about like code and text, he feels like me joining was a move towards also going text-based more than the video-based. We use a lot of slides. We also hired, I think, 9 months ago or a year ago, a curriculum coordinator, a woman who really focuses on certification and course approach, you know, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, and then quizzes. And so we use that whole teaching philosophy. Live training for internally, we do live training for salespeople, non-technical people. I'm not too sure for the developers internally. And we also build tools, experiments, things that teach you, like if you want to learn something, we have a little tool to teach you that. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Any last question? Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.